So welcome, John.
Thank you.
We're very happy to have you here. And we're interested in part, the speakers that are part of this series this year are all people who got their Ph.D.s from the graduate school and did not go into academia.
Right.
And of course, this is of interest to our graduate students because a lot of our graduate students now are also not going into academia, and they're curious about alternative paths and different paths. So maybe you could tell us about your career path.
Yeah.
How did you get where you are today, and was it the route you expected to take?
Yeah. So, good question. I think I've been asked that already a few times today, but it's going to get asked a few more, I suspect. And that is the key for me was when I grew up in Colorado, and I was basically a river rat. I like rivers. I rafted, I hiked, I canoed. I did all those sort of things, kayaking, and I was interested in water. Was interested in rivers, and it wasn't I wasn't going to be a scientist. It was more I was just interested in environmental protection and how people live in rivers and what they do with the rivers. So I knew that's what I wanted to work in. And I also figured out when I was in undergrad at Colorado College that I wanted to study both law and history because I thought it was important to do both. Mm-hmm. So I went to law school first. I had a sense that I really needed to do that first. I went to law school first, but I was unusual there because I wasn't planning to be a lawyer. Mm-hmm. I knew when I went to law school that I was actually going to go get the Ph.D. in history after that. Right. So it was a chosen path to merge them together. And then if you'd asked me what I would do with it, I really didn't know. I knew I just would work somewhere in rivers and water. So I got here, that's another story, because I was actually going to go to Berkeley and ended up bailing out and teaching at the law school there for a year and then giving up and ended up back in Oregon and came down here. And while I was doing the PhD study, and I also probably was unusual as a grad student in that I walked into school knowing exactly what my dissertation was. I knew what I wanted to write. I'd known that for years, so everybody else was kind of stumbling around, and I knew that. And
they probably hated you.
Yeah, it was a little different, I think, than some. And so then while I was working here, I had to fund my graduate student studies in some way, and I taught world history and some of the others, but also I kept my hand in resource work. And I got on a contract. I got hired by the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, interstate agency that does big river energy planning and fish wildlife planning in Portland. And they needed some help, and I started working for them after I'd been here a couple of years, and so I didn't sleep for about 7 years because it was demanding work, and yet I was also trying to do the PhD. And I swear I would have told you I would never, it wasn't so much I knew I'd be an academic exactly, but I did know I didn't intend to practice law. But there's probably 1 or 2 jobs in the whole world of law that I would take, and I got it. And that working for the agency I did, the work isn't really law, it's all policy and politics about big rivers. And they liked what I did. They let me work very strange hours. And when I got close to being done, they offered me a full-time job.
Oh, and you've been there ever since.
Yeah, I started working for them in '92, and I thought I'd probably work for a few years, and it's been 25 years.
Wow.
And I'm their general counsel. That actually happened fairly quickly. But again, it's not really what people think of as law. It's all policy and politics, working with states and tribes and the federal government. And the other thing about the council is, I think it's because I came in sort of from an unusual angle to begin with. They've let me continue that unusual angle ever since. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean, I using the history study from here, I get asked to be to work on Indian water rights issues and other river basins. The council's let me do that, and that's what I'm actually going to talk about today, not the work in the Columbia. They've let me teach. I've taught environmental history and environmental policy at University of Portland and Portland State. Let me write stuff. So it's really, if you looked at my office, it looks like an academic office. It's very much, and we have one of our council members is an economics professor from Washington State who came into my office and said, "This looks like my faculty office." And so I don't know how, it's part of its luck. I don't know how to say it otherwise. I don't think I marked out a path that I wanted to work in rivers and water and the intersection of law and policy and history. Exactly where I ended up was pure luck. I could have ended up doing it in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I would say, which was I think important for the path I ended up, which was, it seemed to me when you do get into the academic world, especially when you start, you have to go where the job is.
Right.
And I very quickly decided I didn't want to leave the Northwest. So I would not have gotten on the path of, a tenure track job in Alabama or something like that. It just wouldn't have happened.
Right.
And so it's just fortuitous that what I was doing just continued. So.
Right. Great.
So yeah, it's a long story, but it really is.
No, it's a good one. It's a good one.
It's been good.
What is your? I mean, what do you like? I'm just sort of curious. I know this is a hard question to answer, maybe, but what does your a day look like, or what does a week look like? Given that it sounds like you're doing a lot of varying things that. When you say policy.
Yeah, that is true. That is right. But you have to understand the council I work for, which is there's a reason we exist. It was created in the 1980s to allow the states to have as long as they would work together. So Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. If they would work together, they could develop energy plans and fish and wildlife programs, which then the federal government has some obligations to implement. And if you think about the 4 states, their politics differ radically.
Mm-hmm.
So a good part of my typical day is actually working with, we do both power energy planning, we do the fish and wildlife planning, and at any moment you're basically trying internally to get your 4 states linked to a common decision, and so of your members. So I don't do much that looks like legal research or law. Instead, I'm on the phone a lot. I'm also there's a part of that is diplomacy, and a part of it is putting together information. I've got political appointees who need to make decisions, and they need to make them. They're not going to get into the details, but they need to know their decisions are based on something solid. So I actually probably spend more of my day working with our technical staff. So we have economists, power system analysts, physicists on the power side. We got biologists and people on the fish side. I mean, one on the power side and then the fish side. And I spend a lot of time with them organizing and helping turn their information to information decision makers can use. Mm-hmm. So it's really decision support, and there's a lot of it. Then I also spend an enormous amount of my time. We get most of our programs funded by the Bonneville Power Administration. They're a major power marketer, and they have 4,000 people. We have 40. They have $4 billion in revenue that we're trying to tap into. So I spend an enormous amount of time either dealing with people at Bonneville or scheming with our staff and members how to get Bonneville to do something. Sometimes it's legal, but more often it's the legal stuff is kind of waved over in the corner. It's more of what's good and what we want to get done. Right. But also every week we have a mission at the council to be a public education body as well. And that's really not my job. It's the public affairs department, but I actually probably spend at least once a week, if not more, giving a talk somewhere on the Columbia or fish issues or energy issues. I was in Boise last week, et cetera, et cetera.
You're here.
Yeah, I'm here. So it's part of my job is actually routinely giving public information, public speeches on the Columbia River Treaty. I've become an expert just purely on needing to communicate what's going on. I'm probably one of the leading writers now on the Columbia River Treaty, which wasn't intentional, just became that. So anyway.
Yeah. So the council it's a nonprofit. Is it an interstate agency?
It's an interstate compact agency. It's actually a weird government where it required a federal act that under the compact clause of the Constitution allows the 4 states to create an agency. And we're not the federal government and we're not the states. And so whenever I go anywhere and, getting a government rate in a hotel is always kind of complicated because are you the states? No, we're not the feds either. We made up our own IDs that have this very funny looking logo on them. But yeah, we're a government entity with governmental powers, but we're not a sovereign state, we're not a sovereign tribe, we're not a sovereign federal government. We sort of sit in the middle. And our job really is planning and then mediating between all those entities I go to meetings where there's anywhere from representatives from anywhere from 5 to 11 federal agencies in the room. There's we have up to 15 Indian tribes with management rights and treaty rights in the river. We got the 4 states. That's some of what I do is go to meetings like that, trying to get everybody to, it's not always everybody, but it's often some of those people, trying to get them to do things. So.
Right.
And, you know, I got asked earlier today, I was over talking to some of the grad students in the history department about do I use the history part of what I do? And the answer is kind of funny because I do, but it's not like I sit there and we talk history. What it is I think the history studies, when you go to law school, you get trained as an advocate. You get trained to pursue a position. But the work I do, that wouldn't make much sense. You know, what I've really tried to do is bring together and make decisions around that a bunch of people will buy into, whether it's our own decision makers or others. And the history stuff, I think, gives you, maybe it's just my own personality anyway, but it gives you a lot of almost empathy for different perspectives. And so I spend most of my time trying to figure out, well, what do they need, what do they need, and how do we make it actually work to something that's meaningful and not... and that's the best part of what we do, because you're smashing together all those different interests, and a lot of times it doesn't work, but when it does work and you do something that's significant, it really feels good. You know, it's really quite meaningful. So that's been one of the better parts of what I end up doing.
Right, sort of finding a solution that kind of builds value, and that there's something for everybody in it.
Yeah. I mean, one of the main things we were created to try to think about the most economical way to keep the power system and evolve it. It's a Northwest full of hydropower. The region tried to add nuclear power plants at one time. It was a disaster. We got started. One of the things we have discovered, our technical people are very good at describing the benefits of energy efficiency and conservation and the value in that. My job is often getting that into decision making and getting it done. And in 30 years, we haven't needed to build a new power plant in the region. We've funded 8,000 megawatts of efficiency. And it's been great. You know, it just feels good every time we do it. So it's good.
Very cool.
It's good work. And we wouldn't exist but for one of the momentous parts of Northwest history, which was the failed attempt to build 5 nuclear power plants at once in the 60s and 70s. And I'm keeper of that story. I tell it all the time. So.
Is that part of your talk today, or
no, actually it won't, because I talk about the Columbia. No, you know, so when they asked me to talk today, there's 2 pieces of work I got involved in, not with the council that I work with now, but separate projects. That were, one is on the Allegheny, had to do with the Allegheny River and the Seneca Nation, and the other is up in the Yukon with the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council. And I decided to pick them because they, for one thing, they best illustrate how I put together all the pieces, because the stuff I do in the Columbia, I don't think I'd have that job if I hadn't done the work here, but I could have. Whereas the other work, it combines, you know, the big river planning and management issues along with the study I did here in native water rights. And that's because of that work here, I both have the expertise and the ability to do these other jobs. And so both of them were things I did in the last 10 years. 2 different projects I got asked to be involved in, and it really was some of the best work I ever did, and neither of them came to anything. And they're great, but for reasons, they both bollocksed up at the end, and I'm still actually coming to grips with what happened and what to do with it, because it's good stuff. It was good work, and there's potential there still. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to actually do that. So I'm not going to talk about the Columbia, but I can do that too. I mean, that's just something I do every day.
But will we get to hear about the failed nuclear plants?
Well, we won't today, but I can do it now, which was, if you've never heard of, have you heard of Whoops? You ever heard of Whoops? No, so people need to know Whoops. In the Northwest, we developed from the 30s through the 70s this massive hydropower system on the Columbia, including mostly federal dams, some non-federal. And when we hit the 60s and the 70s, rather than sort of sitting back and going, well, that was great, we got a lot of power, there were concerns that we would need additional power in the region. And in that period of time, I hate to put it this way, but real men built power plants. So they wanted to build coal plants and nuclear power plants in the Northwest. And no individual utility would step up and do that, because they were, whoever built the plants would take on the cost, the high cost of the thermal plant, and everybody else would get the benefit of low-cost hydro. So the Bonneville Power Administration, which is the federal agency that markets the hydro, worked with the utilities on what was called the hydrothermal program. And the whole point of it was we would socialize, whoever developed the thermal plant Bonneville would buy the cost of that, buy the output, and then meld it with the low-cost hydro and sell it out at a melded rate. So it was a way that you could spread the risk of developing the high-cost thermal. And in doing that, all the little podunk public utilities in the Northwest, especially in Washington, formed what was called the Washington Public Power Supply System, WPPSS, or WHOOPS. And they decided to build 5 nuclear power plants at once when we didn't need any. And they didn't know how to build or run one, and they tried to build 5. That was in the 60s and 70s. Bonneville funded the first 3. And out of those first 3, only 1 ever got built. It's what's now the only nuclear power plant in the Northwest, at WNP2. But we really didn't even need it, but we built it. But it cost billions of dollars to build that one because the other 2 went belly up. Bonneville had to absorb the debt, and they now pay every year close to hundreds of millions, close to $1 billion still in debt payments now, 50 years later. The other 2 plants, Bonneville, by the time they got to 4 and 5, they trying to work on that. By then it was clear that Bonneville had no business being in this, funding these. So the utilities took them on themselves, and it became the world's largest municipal bond default ever. And it ruined the credit of the Northwest for a good 30 years, all trying to build nuclear power plants, of which, again, we got 1 out of the 5. We didn't need any of them. And we're still bearing the cost burden of them. And it was out of that there was a perception that the Northwest needed, and the states particularly, the states felt like they were not part of the decision making, and they wanted a decision to be made. So they wanted to be part of it. So the Northwest Power Act of 1980 was essentially a regional deal that we got Congress to approve that created the council. And we do energy planning. And meanwhile, all the salmon runs had gone to hell because of a lot of reasons, but including the hydropower. So we were also tasked with doing a fish and wildlife program for the Columbia that uses hydropower revenue to buy. So we're not a regulatory agency. What we do is we can tap into the Bonneville Ratepayer Fund to buy good things. We buy, energy efficiency, and we buy fish and wildlife protection and mitigation the program now spends about $500 million a year. So that's one of the things I sit on top of is I'm
big budget.
Part of that. Yeah, we have a big budget. It's not our budget. We only have a small staff. We have 8 council members and about 30 professional and support staff, and that's it. So we're intentionally small, but it's the work we do.
Right.
So anyway, the whoop thing. And by the way, there is one of the professors of history here, Daniel Pope. I don't know if you know Daniel. He wrote a book about it. So I help review it and stuff called Nuclear Implosion. So Daniel's a good writer on it.
Great.
So anyway, that's the story that's where we live, and it's funny because
born out of the whoops.
in 70, if you were here 30 years ago, you'd say whoops, everybody knew it.
I moved here about 22 years ago.
Yeah, and now nobody. You mentioned that, almost nobody's heard of it unless they've been here for a long time. So it was a big deal.
Yeah, cool. All right, so what career advice would you give UO graduate students who are considering careers outside of academia?
Yeah, so one thing I did tell some people earlier today, I think, I didn't do it intentionally, but I have both the law degree and the history degree, and they're both valuable. You're probably better off if you're interested in some topic, and history is what you study, but you want to work on it. It also helps to get some other training. I know it's hard to tell that to people who are getting a Ph.D. or a master's that you need more. But boy, if you can link the history degree with some technical training, some little pieces, you're just so much more valuable. You can do well with just the PhD itself. But I had one of the students who's interested in water issues. She's working on a PhD. If she also got Oregon State has a fabulous program in transboundary water management. It's part of their geosciences department. It's half technical, half sort of social science. It's a 2-year program with one of the leading international water experts in the entire world. You combine those 2 things, all of a sudden you're actually even far more valuable than just the study here. So,
sure, right.
So I think that's part of it. The other part is sometimes it's a matter of just picking where you want to live and just finding a way to work in what you want. And it may be working in a way you don't like at first, but if you're working in the subject you want, in the place you want, eventually you'll find your way into something meaningful, I think. At least that's it's easy for me to say that because it worked, but
Right.
it may not work for everybody, but it did for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good
So-
good advice.
So,
Um,
yeah.
So this is maybe kind of related. You've already answered it to some extent, but what do you think are the most valuable skills for graduate students who are considering careers outside of academia?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, part of it probably is, even if you don't get official training, knowing more than just the history study of whatever you're interested in working in is going to be critical, I think. I do think the history study, one of the best things about study of history is the ability to take a lot of information and synthesize it into something useful. The better that skill is the kind of skill that's useful in other fields. It's what you learn in law school too, which is how to take a complex subject and synthesize it down into the decisions and the framework. Make some conceptual, logic out of it and figure out what you need to do. So, probably more than anything else, that kind of skill.
Right.
It's an analytical skill. It's a little more than just. Some people have also the gift of just networking and interacting with people, but I think part of it is just learning the kind of skill that can solve problems and break them down and apply information to them and make logical paths out of them is probably more than anything else.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because one of the things we've found is that almost every PhD program teaches that kind of synthesis and analytical thinking, and I think it's often hard for graduate students to translate that to potential job offers.
It probably is.
And they sort of think, well, I don't have any skills. It's like, no, of course you have skills.
Yeah,
What is it you've been doing for the last 6 years? You've been
it.
learning all kinds of things, but and that sort of high level, like you said, analysis and being able to break it down
and especially if you can do it in a, I think the other thing, once you've been through a PhD process, and because there's got to be a creative part to it too. I think what's made me successful is you can't just get into a particular box. You got to be creative in how you use the tools that you have and use them and turn them in directions you want. So that again, I think going through the process of, especially PhD, I never did the master's, so they let me in from the law degree right into the PhD program. So I never did a master's, but I assume it gives you some similar. It seems like it's a lot to do very quickly in a couple of years, whereas the PhD gives you some luxury. But
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think is fun is to hear about what your memories of being in graduate school here, what it was like on campus, what it was like in Eugene, what it was like in the world at that time.
So, so it was late 80s and early 90s, and actually, I'm not kidding, my main memory of my 7 years here was I didn't sleep. And that's because I was trying to keep, I got asked this today from some of the students, was study of law school harder or more demanding than the PhD role? There's no comparison. Doing a PhD is way more intense. Law school was actually not that. I mean, it's concentrated and it's work, but the volume is just so little. The volume of work of a PhD, at least in history, the amount you have to read, the amount you have to cover, all the fields, it was just enormous. So there's a lot of work there. I was doing the graduate teaching fellowship. But I was trying to keep my hand in resource work, and especially when the council started asking me to help them, that took a lot. And then we had a baby in '91.
So you really didn't sleep.
I swear, I'd get up and I'd come here and I'd go to my office and I'd do work, and then I'd study and teaching fellow or whatever it was, and then I'd try to go home and be home for a little while and be with the kid, and everybody go to bed, and I'd go back to my office and work at my other job, till 2 or 3 in the morning. So so that was part of it. It was fun though. I liked living in Eugene. It was fun. I don't know why. It was just, I liked the town. We were over the history department at that time was in the PLC building, which is a horrible building to be in, but that's all right.
Sorry.
Yeah, then we moved over to the law school, but it was just such a, it was one of those times where I didn't really, very focused internally, very focused on the work I was doing and just in the little community we're in, and that was pretty much it. While we were here, we actually got an opportunity. We had a little house up on Kincaid, but an opportunity came where an old house in Fairmont that on Rose Lane, which had been, I can't remember their name now, but it's now, when we bought it, when we sold it to Bryna Goodman and her husband Peter, who is a history professor. But it was built in the 30s by I can't remember the guy, it's an architect, Wilcox I think it was, and it was built for a man who became the head of the business department here, business school for years. And it was really cool because it was a neat old Eugene house with a real connection to the university, and a lot of people kind of knew the story and knew the house, and it was really neat.
Right.
I didn't end up staying in Eugene because it just wasn't gonna work, but I really liked living here. It was fun.
And the council is based in Portland?
Portland, yeah. So we're down. I got my office is downtown Portland.
Right.
Trying to think of the university at that time. Everything, it was. I came here right after there was about a 2-year effort when they were going to shift the semester system. You've heard the stories about that, and then it went belly up. The legislature refused to let them do it, and I think they lost. I mean, everybody seemed to be quite demoralized from the faculty for a couple of years because they just had put such a great effort into it, and then it fell apart. And so it seemed like for a while there, I think they were losing faculty members, and there was just a real sort of downer feeling for a few years, and that seemed to go away over time. But yeah, that was really, I think it was hard on people. And as grad students come in, you only vaguely knew about it, but it seemed like it had. And one of the things that happened real quick, and I assume it's because I was not the normal grad student. I came in with, I'd been a lawyer and legal stuff and all that. So they quickly, I think, realized the use, and I ended up on search committees for, so I was on like 3 different search committees for the Beekman Professor of Northwest History, and the time we hired in Japanese history and stuff. That was a lot of fun. I actually got a window into how that all works.
Do you remember any of the people that you hired?
Oh yeah, Jeffrey Haynes is still here. Peggy Pasco was the Beekman Professor. That was a disaster. Because that was the one endowed chair a history department had then. Now it's got 3 or 4, but it had one then, and it was a major position in Western U.S. history. Richard Maxwell Brown, Dick Brown, he'd been my advisor. He was retiring. We were replacing him, and it was a 3-year meltdown because the trouble was it was a field that was incredibly vibrant with young scholars, and none of them had reached the full professor level. So the original search was supposedly, you're hiring a full professor at the highest level. And so the original search was bringing in, I wouldn't call them old, but it was people who were
establishment,
and they weren't part of this new Western
wave.
history. So we had a pool of people we all looked at and went, those aren't really the exciting people. What do we do? So we went through it all. We decided, they made one offer, and that person decided not to come, and it probably was good. It didn't, and then it got put on hiatus, and we went through that over 3 years.
Wow.
And then eventually, what we did is, I don't know how it happened exactly, but we opened up the field to people who had one good book and hadn't gotten to full professor level, and all of a sudden we got some really good applicants, and I was gone pretty soon after that, so I really liked Peggy Pasco we hired, and I understand she's later died, and I feel very bad about that because she was great. I really liked her, but it came to a good conclusion, but man, was it a mess.
Maybe that's why you didn't go into
academia, right? I wouldn't have. I must admit, I don't, the parts that are the non-teaching academic parts don't look like a lot of fun. So I know they need to be done, and it's amazing how much people fight over stuff that seems pretty trivial, to tell the truth.
Well, there's actually John Arbell, who was probably here when you were in political science, but he says that that's one of the reasons why academic fights are so brutal and bitter is because they're over nothing.
Basically for symbolism,
so
but so I did a lot of that. I really liked to study, I actually liked just learning about the history. I actually, the part that I thought was the most successful and fun of the entire time was actually my orals to do for my major field. Because it was you just spent years reading a bunch of books, and then you sat in a room with Jim Moore, who was department head at the time, and Richard Brown, and a bunch of very good historians, and had a long afternoon conversation that was really a conversation among experts trying to sort of wrestle with what history tells you that's useful. I remember that. That's one of my best days. I really loved it.
Great, good. Do you ever get out on rivers anymore?
Oh yeah. I own 2 or 3 kayaks, and part of the thing I'll talk about today was up in the Yukon. I got on the river quite a bit, and so a bunch of the pictures I have were from the river. And in fact, the poster they have that was put together is one of my pictures on the Yukon.
That's funny because when you said that earlier about the kayaks, I was like, but that's why they had that picture.
Yeah, so that was a canoe trip. I know, I get out. We, in part, we live near the Columbia, and I've got a dog, and so we just walk the rivers. We're down the Sandy River Delta all the time. But yeah, the kayaks get out and the canoes get out, and so that's
See
fun.
mosquitoes in the Yukon?
Oddly enough, we were there in summer, the main year. I've been up there a number of times, and sometimes it did, but the year I had the month-long canoe trip, 2011, we were there in July and August, and it was an unusually wet, cold, and high water summer, which made it incredibly difficult to camp, and you were wet the whole time, but it kept away the mosquitoes.
Right.
And it also kept the bears away from the main stem because there's too much water. So it was a very unusual Yukon canoeing experience, as everybody tells me. So I got them a couple years later. I got them pretty good when I was up there again, but the main time was not. So
not too bad.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. Anything else you want to tell us?
Well, one thing, just thanks. This is fun. I mean, it's fun coming back. I appreciate that people, came and looked for me, and that I got something. I am thankful every day that I took let's put it this way. When I went to law school, I got a job clerking for a judge. I got a job for 1 year at Berkeley teaching law. There was a 2-year period in there where I worked for a big law firm. And when I said I'm going back to do the Ph.D., which I was going to do all the time, but I didn't let people know. I'm going to tell my parents about it, and everybody thought I was nuts. Because why are you going? You've gotten through all this, and now you're going back and doing that, and why do it?
Out of poverty. And
And I just said no. It's something. If I don't do it, I will always regret not doing it. And then when I did it, I just said that I still think that's the best thing I ever did. I mean, I would regret it. It's made my career so much more interesting than it would have been. I'm just really happy I did it.
Great.
So I'm glad that, the one thing I tried for years after I left here to at least keep up with the history journals, keep up with the field, and I couldn't. It's too hard to do that when I didn't have to use it day to day. So I do kind of miss it. Actually, when I was here, one of the things they were just starting and I got involved in was the World History Program. The main, before that, the main surveys were U.S. History and Western Civ, and they were developing and building up the World History Survey Program. And that's what I ended up teaching in. And I love that. I've never had to use, I've never taught, I taught Indian history and Vietnamese history and, you learn just enough to be dangerous, I think, every part of the world where you're trying to teach. But man, I love that class. And really, Randy McGowan and Glenn May and some of the others, I love working with them. So
right.
I thought that was neat. And I've never used that part again. I've used a lot of my environmental history and U.S. stuff, but I've never used that again. And it's incredibly valuable. I feel like I know things that I wouldn't otherwise know. So.
Well, I know from reading the information that the history department sent over in nominating for this that you have traveled to a lot. So maybe you got to use it there because actually I think one of the places
I ended up getting a chance to go work in Vietnam. I worked on canal projects in South Vietnam for a while, and it was probably connected. I knew when I got over there what context I was coming into, and the same ways are different. Yeah, that's true. It's really led to some of those. And actually, one story that finishes it, because I told you when I came down here to Gustu, I had nobody could understand why I did it, and thought I was nuts, including my parents. I mean, they loved me and they didn't care that much, but my dad was completely mystified. And then that was in the late 80s, and then by 96, 97, when I finished the dissertation and defended it, they came out for it. And my dad actually sat in the hotel room and read the dissertation, and then he sat through the defense, and this actually makes me cry, because it's funny to cry. But he basically said, afterwards we went to dinner. He said, now I figured out why you did it.
Oh.
Yeah. I haven't thought about that for a long time.
Oh.
Anyway, that was a cool part of it.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Very cool. Well, great.
Yeah.
Well, we're very happy
Thanks.
to have you, and it's really neat for us to have graduate alums
Yeah.
come back, because I think
Yeah.
often when people think about alumni of an institution, it's the undergraduate alumni,
Yeah.
the people who went to football games and
Yeah, I know.
and of course our graduate students do really wonderful work,
Yeah.
and then they go, but they don't have necessarily that same identity or that desire to come
Yeah,
back.
yeah.
So we're really excited about having an opportunity to bring them back and hear about what they're doing and
Yeah.
what they did.
Yeah, it is a different experience.
Yeah.
I was here from '89 to '97, and I never went to a football game once. And it wasn't necessarily that I disliked it.
No,
It just wasn't part
you're busy
of the,
not sleeping.
yeah, it just wasn't part of the conversation.
Right.
So
No, I think
anyway.
it's a very different experience, and it's
Yeah.
funny if you follow a tour of the U of O campus. You know,
Yeah.
they're very much oriented towards undergraduates too. And
Yeah,
I
I'm
always
sure
think there
they
should be one that's
Yeah.
more oriented towards.
Yeah, since I've been here, they built the the Hall of Law over here, the fancy law school, and
Yeah.
things like that they didn't have on the campus before. So
Right.
it's changed a bunch. But
Yeah, I think the law school is notable that they're old law schools. That the campus
Yeah.
is littered with old law schools.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
math building is an
Fenton-
old law
Fenton
school,
was
and
one, and then
Mackenzie
the
is an old law
Mackenzie.
building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the things I remember when here, because Lawrence Hall was, I mean, they've obviously renovated that substantially, but that was just a rabbit warren when I was here. And I liked it. Actually, I did more studying. When I just had to read a book, I didn't need to do anything, I actually would wander over to Lawrence. I love that building because you could go, connecting the different weird parts to it. You'd find a little room and sit there and with a nice old architectural window to sit in the window box and look out. I just loved it. That was my favorite building, really.
Interesting. Yeah.
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 I got out of PLC every moment I could, that's for sure.
Okay. The PLC doesn't have sort of comfortable
Oh, no,
corners.
there's
does it?
nothing about it that was
Yeah.
good, but it is what it is. So,
Right.
yeah.
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 Cool.
All right.
Great. All
Well,
right.
thank you. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.